Beretta Lynn, and I am the founder of Distinguished Educational Consulting Group. And today I'm going to show you how to reimagine your classroom by giving you tips for educators and school leaders on how to create a student-centered classroom. Because here's the thing, a successful classroom is all about students and of course our teachers. But I'm going to guide you through a process of creating a space where all learners can thrive and become their best selves. Why student-centered classrooms? Well, it's the beginning of the year, and as a lot of educators and students are returning back to their classrooms, the first thing we're thinking about is, how can I make sure I have a very successful year? And let's be honest, sometimes those behaviors can really disrupt and impede instruction. As a school leader, student-centered classrooms is one of the first professional learnings that I plan, because I truly believe that how you start the year is a good indicator of how the school year will continue to go, and it's the best way to prevent disruptive behaviors in the classroom. Teaching in an urban classroom and leading in an urban school for the past 23 years, I do know that behaviors can impede learning. I recently saw actually on TikTok that someone said that student behaviors and behaviors in the classroom was one of the reasons that most educators and school leaders are leaving the profession. So I felt that this was one of the best topics to introduce to this channel. Many times when teachers and students return to the classroom, most people want to jump in and get started with instruction. But I'd really implore you to think about how you're setting up your classroom and how you're setting up your classroom community before you get started with instruction. So tip 1, create a list of expectations with your students. Try to avoid going to a lot of these educational stores and buying a poster board with rules. I mean, when we all started out in education, that's a lot of times that's what we did. We went to most stores, we found a poster with either blanks where we could write down all our rules, or sometimes we ordered a poster with rules already listed. I would ask that you try to avoid that. In order to create a student-centered classroom, it is important that you create a list of expectations with your students. And this list will help you describe what your classroom looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. Ultimately, with your students, you'll create a list of expectations on how your classroom will run. So this could include something like that you may ask your students, when I'm teaching, how do you want our classroom to sound? When you're learning, how do you want our classroom to sound? Or when I ask a question, how is the best way that we can make sure that I hear you? And you can help guide students to respond with, most kids will come out with likely, we should raise our hands, or we shouldn't talk while you're talking. And as they begin to build this list of expectations, be sure to chart them down, because you will ultimately have a final list of expectations that you will continue to review with your students day after day. This is important because we know that a lot of times during a classroom instruction, we are called to do different things. We may have to work with a small group. We may be checking someone's work. So what you really want to do is build a classroom of accountability so that students understand and know and have bought into the expectations that were set during the first day of school. And one of the beautiful things that can occur is that students will eventually respectfully hold each other accountable, because they all understand the expectations that were set in the beginning of the year. I would highly recommend that you don't make more than 4 to 6 of these expectations. Try to make them encompass most of the routines and procedures that are included in your classroom. I also want you to be certain to choose expectations that you can actually enforce. In other words, don't make the threats that we like to make when we get angry that we cannot back up, or we don't even have the authority to carry out. So this might sound like, the next person that talks, I'm going to put you out of my room. Or if you don't do your work, I'm going to give everybody an F. Those type of threats, what they'll do is they'll remove the power that you have later on, because you don't really actually have the power to enforce them. Also be certain not to make a threat that somebody else has to reinforce. Because again, when we are frustrated, sometimes we give the power to outside authorities. So for example, we may say, sit down or I'll call the dean. Be quiet or I'll call the principal. Or sit down or don't do that or I'll call your parent. We want to make sure that we maintain the power in our room, or the power shared in our room around these expectations, by holding students accountable by the expectations, and then also having consequences that we'll use when those expectations are violated. And that leads me to tip 2. Try not to warn students about consequences in advance. Warning kids about consequences in advance takes away your ability to address individual situations when they arise. When you try to blanket consequences early on, you hold every student, regardless of the situation. Even though we know that situations are different, you're still holding them to the same consequence regardless of whether the situation or whatever happened is unique. Try not to assign blanketed consequences to all the problem. Try to look at them individually as the situation arises. I believe this is super important to have these consequences, because depending on where you work, depending on who your administrator is, and depending on what district you work in, you might be solely responsible for maintaining the behavior management in your classroom. I have seen, heard, and worked with a lot of educators who are very frustrated because they feel like when behaviors occur in their classroom, no one does anything. So although wherever you're teaching that may be the case, it is also helpful to maintain expectations and consequences and accountability in your own classroom to, let's just be honest, to keep your own sanity. Sometimes in some places you have the support of the administrator and parents and school and the school system. Sometimes you don't. So in order to set you up for success, you have to come with those systems and procedures already planned, so that again, regardless of your outside circumstances, you can maintain a calm and respectful community in your class. So tip 3, post the expectations. Many times we create expectations, we do all this work, and then we don't post them and we don't come back to them. We never bring them up again, and then we wonder why 3 months later we're struggling with behaviors that are disruptive. We don't have anything to fall back on because we didn't reinforce those expectations. And what we do know is that first week of school, first month of school, everybody's an angel. A lot of kids do exactly what they're supposed to do, but as they get comfortable, those disruptive and sometimes destructive behaviors start to arise. So after you post those expectations, review them every day with your students. Hold them accountable, go over them, have other students lead them and talk about them. Tip 4, as stated earlier, create that list of consequences. You don't have to make sure the students know the list of consequences ahead of time, but they should know that there are consequences when they violate the expectations, and they should know that that a consequence will be used when they do violate the classroom expectations. This is so important because if you do not stay up on this, if you don't hold kids accountable, especially early, the more that kids slip through the cracks, the less power your expectations and your consequences have. Also, it will create problems amongst your classroom community if you only hold some students accountable for certain things and let other kids get away with violating those expectations without consequences. So because of that, one of the things I highly suggest is to delay consequences. And I know that may seem a little unrealistic, but what I would suggest is, although you're delaying consequences, it does not mean that students do not know they're going to receive a consequence. So what that can look like is student A has violated the out of their seat without permission expectation. You might call them in after the rest have left. You have a small conversation with them indicating that they were out of their seat and there will be they will serve a consequence. After that, you might want to take some time to maybe talk with other colleagues. If you don't know exactly what to do in that particular circumstance, review it with your administrator. But definitely have the conversation with the child's parent, and then let them know that this is what happened and there'll be a consequence coming, and it will likely be X. And then have that constructive conversation with the parent, so that the parent knows that a classroom expectation was violated. You have discussed a consequence with them, and you have gotten to them before their child has got home and told their side of the story. So most times in classrooms, even as an educator, especially when we're frustrated, it's very easy to name the behavior, assign a consequence that may be unfair at the time because we were so upset, and then they go home and they spin their story. Then the parent calls and they have half the story and they're upset. And those of us who have been teaching for a long time know this goes on and on and on. So I would encourage you to name the behavior with the student. Tell them they're going to receive a consequence. As soon as possible, go and call the parent, name the behavior, let them know that this is the consequence you've decided on, and then come back to the student, let them know this is the consequence they will be serving, and then move on. Tip 5, be consistent, especially in the beginning. And I know what I'm saying is sometimes so unrealistic, especially in the midst of your day, in the midst of classroom instruction. But if you are consistent in the beginning, it will run itself later on. I am trying to highly encourage you to be consistent in the beginning. As an administrator, I have seen the difference between classrooms of those who are consistent the first 30 to 45 days and those who created a classroom list, stuck it on the wall and walked away from it, and then consistently had behavior problems throughout the year. New expectations in the beginning of class. Review them again during transitions. Review them again when we're cleaning up. And that if you do that consistently for 30 to 45 days, and you consistently address behaviors when you see them, and consistently assign consequences when they're violated, after the first 45 days, your class will run itself. And the funny thing is that I have seen multiple times is the students will hold themselves accountable, and students will respectfully hold each other accountable because they have bought into expectations. Why? Because they have built the expectations of your classroom. Tip 6, and this is as important as the other ones. Take time to learn your students' cultures and identities. And it seems like this wouldn't be as important as the others. I have seen multiple educators do 1 or 2 assignments about who I am in the beginning of the year, and then they might hang it up outside and they move on. Students who are seen, heard, and affirmed in their classrooms behave according to the expectations in that classroom. If I'm a student and I know that my classroom community knows who I am, knows where I'm from, knows what I like, knows what I don't like, they know my learning style, and they care about all those things, believe it or not, it changes how students behave, and it changes how students interact with each other. I would make sure that you design exercises or activities in the beginning of the year that allow students to identify their cultures and their backgrounds, and that identify their names and why they got their name and how important their name is to them. We should not be in the habit of giving students nicknames because we lack the ability to pronounce their names correctly. Their names are their identities. They were given to them by their parents, and we should have the respect to utilize them and use them correctly. Additionally, plan other activities that allow students to show how they learn, their learning styles. Is it kinesthetic? Are they more visual learners? At the end of the day, as an administrator, the first 2 weeks of school, when I come into classrooms, I want to see students in those classrooms. What I mean is I want to see flags from their countries. I would like to see who they are. I should not be able to walk out of one classroom and into another classroom and not be able to differentiate what students are in one as opposed to what students are in the other. This all leads to a student-centered classroom community where everybody is respected. And when everyone is respected, I'm telling you, behaviors that may or may not arise will be quickly quashed because of the respect that each student has for each other and themselves. So lastly, but certainly no less important, tip number 7, have fun. You know, the funny thing is, over the years of being an educator, a lot of my students think that regardless of how old we actually are, you know, in their minds we're 100 years old and we have no life outside of school and we have no fun, and we all come home and just get the red marker out and mark their papers and then come back the next morning miserable and to do it all over again. But some of the best classrooms that I have seen are ones where students are actively engaged and they're having fun. There is nothing wrong with laughter. There is nothing wrong with students actually having fun while they're working in small groups. There is nothing wrong with playing some music while they're working independently. There is no reason that you can't open your lesson every day with a joke or ask students to find jokes and share them with the class. The more fun you have and the more you make sure you're enjoying yourself while teaching, your enthusiasm will rub off on your students and create a learning environment and experience that everyone loves. Thank you for watching Becoming Distinguished, where we provide support that educators need to be their best.